Pittsburgh, February 1901. A cold morning along the Monongahela River. Smoke rises from a dozen furnaces, orange against the gray winter sky. Somewhere in the hills above, in a mansion overlooking the city he helped build, a 65-year-old Scottish immigrant signs a piece of paper. With that signature, Andrew Carnegie walks away from steel forever, and the largest corporation the world has ever seen is born. $1.4 billion in 1901. When the entire federal government operated on $500 million, when a skilled worker earned perhaps $400 a year, when $1 billion was a number reserved for astronomers, not businessmen. United States Steel Corporation, the first company to be worth more than $1 billion, the first to employ more than 100,000 workers, the first to control two-thirds of an entire American industry. They called it simply the corporation. And for the next century, its story would be inseparable from the story of America itself. Its steel would rise in the Empire State Building and the Golden Gate Bridge. It would armor battleships in 2 world wars. It would lay the rails that connected a continent. But behind the grandeur, there was something else. Something the promotional films never showed. Something the annual reports never mentioned. The cost. The human cost. The environmental cost. The cost to communities that rose and fell with the corporation's fortunes. The cost to workers who gave their bodies, their health, their lives to forge the metal that built modern America. This is that story, not the story of triumph that the corporation liked to tell, but the story of what was sacrificed, who was sacrificed, and what happens when a company becomes so large, so powerful, that it shapes not just an industry, but an entire nation's destiny. The question is simple. What does it really cost to build an empire? The answer, as it turns out, is far more complicated than anyone wanted to admit. To understand U.S. Steel, you first have to understand the man who made it possible, not the banker who assembled it, the immigrant who built what the banker bought. Andrew Carnegie arrived in America in 1848. He was 12 years old. His family had been driven from Scotland by the same industrial revolution that would later make him rich. His father was a handloom weaver, made obsolete by machines. They landed in Pittsburgh with nothing. The young Carnegie went to work in a cotton factory, then as a telegraph messenger, then as a railroad man, learning the business from the ground up. He was brilliant, relentless, and utterly ruthless in his pursuit of wealth. By the 1870s, he had turned his attention to steel. The timing was perfect. America was building railroads at a furious pace, and railroads needed steel rails. Carnegie Steel Company would give them exactly what they needed. But first, Carnegie had to learn the business. He did what he always did. He watched, he listened, he calculated. In 1872, he traveled to England to study the Bessemer process firsthand. What he saw changed everything. The old method of making steel, the puddling process, was slow and labor-intensive. A skilled puddler could produce maybe 500 pounds of steel a day, stirring molten iron in a small furnace until the carbon burned off. The Bessemer converter was different. It was a massive pear-shaped vessel that could hold tons of molten iron. Air was blasted through the metal at tremendous pressure, burning off impurities in a spectacular shower of sparks. A single converter could produce as much steel in 20 minutes as a puddler could make in a week. Carnegie saw the future. He came home and began planning the most modern steel mill the world had ever seen. The Edgar Thomson Steel Works opened in 1875, named for the president of the Pennsylvania Railroad, Carnegie's most important customer. It was located in Braddock, Pennsylvania, on the banks of the Monongahela River. The site was chosen carefully, close to railroad lines for shipping, close to rivers for water supply, close to the coal and iron ore that would feed the furnaces. From the beginning, Carnegie was obsessed with efficiency. He hired chemists to analyze the composition of his raw materials, ensuring that every batch of steel met exact specifications. He installed the latest equipment regardless of cost, knowing that higher productivity would pay for itself. He drove his managers relentlessly, demanding constant improvements in output and reductions in cost. The results were remarkable. In its first full year of operation, the Edgar Thomson Works produced more than 30,000 tons of steel rails. Within a decade, Carnegie Steel was producing more rails than all other American steelmakers combined. But rails were just the beginning. As the railroad boom slowed in the 1890s, Carnegie pivoted to structural steel for buildings and bridges. He added the Homestead Steel Works, capable of producing the massive beams needed for the new skyscrapers rising in New York and Chicago. He acquired the Duquesne Works, known for its innovative continuous production methods. By the late 1890s, Carnegie controlled an empire: iron ore mines in Minnesota's Mesabi Range, coal mines and coke ovens in Pennsylvania, railroads and steamships to transport the raw materials, steel mills stretching for miles along the rivers of Pittsburgh. The numbers were staggering. Carnegie Steel produced 4 million tons of steel in 1900, more than the entire British steel industry. Its profits exceeded $40 million a year in an era when a dollar had 20 times its current purchasing power. Carnegie himself had become one of the richest people in human history. But the profits came at a cost, a human cost that Carnegie preferred not to examine too closely. The key was the Bessemer process, a technology that could produce steel faster and cheaper than ever before. Carnegie embraced it completely. He built the largest, most modern steel mills in the world. He bought iron ore mines in Minnesota. He purchased railroads to transport the ore. He acquired coke plants to fuel the furnaces. Vertical integration, they called it. Control everything from the raw material to the finished product. By 1892, Carnegie Steel was producing more steel than all of Britain. By the late 1890s, it was the most profitable company in America. Carnegie himself was worth somewhere around $300 million, making him one of the richest men who had ever lived. But the profits came at a price. And the people who paid that price worked 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, in conditions that would be unimaginable today. The steel mills of Pittsburgh in the 1890s were, quite simply, among the most dangerous workplaces on Earth. Imagine walking into a building so vast you can barely see the far walls through the smoke and heat haze. Furnaces burning at temperatures above 2,000 degrees. Rivers of molten metal flowing through channels in the floor. Overhead cranes swinging loads of glowing ingots that could crush a man in an instant. The heat was almost unimaginable. Near the blast furnaces, temperatures routinely exceeded 140 degrees. Workers stripped to the waist, their bodies glistening with sweat that evaporated almost as soon as it formed. They wrapped their heads in wet cloths that dried within minutes. They drank gallons of water a day and still became dehydrated. One contemporary account describes a worker called a puller-out, whose job was to guide the white-hot steel billets as they emerged from the rolling mills. He worked in temperatures that would blister bare skin from several feet away. His face was permanently reddened and scarred from exposure to the radiant heat. His eyebrows and eyelashes had been singed away long ago. He was 35 years old and looked 60. The noise was deafening. The roar of the furnaces, the crash of the hammers, the screech of metal being shaped and cut. Workers communicated by hand signals because voices could not be heard over the din. Many developed permanent hearing damage. By middle age, most furnace workers were substantially deaf. And the pace was relentless. The mills ran 24 hours a day, and the men who worked them were divided into 2 shifts. 12 hours on, 12 hours off. Day shift 1 week, night shift the next. No weekends, no holidays, no rest. Every 2 weeks came the dreaded long turn, when the shifts rotated. A man finishing his night shift at 6 in the morning would be expected back at 6 that same evening, beginning a 24-hour stint that ended only when his replacement arrived the next morning. 24 hours of continuous work in heat and noise and danger. Men hallucinated from exhaustion. They collapsed at their posts. They made fatal mistakes because they could no longer see or think clearly. Contemporary accounts describe what this meant in human terms. A steelworker's memoir from the period recalls that workers would eat their meals standing up, often near the furnaces, because there was no time to go elsewhere. They would lose consciousness from the heat and be dragged to cooler areas, only to return to work as soon as they revived. They would work through injuries that today would require hospitalization. A survey of Pittsburgh workers in 1910 found that the average steelworker had not taken a single vacation in 6 years. Many had not taken a full day off in months. Their lives consisted of work, sleep, and nothing else. They saw their families only in passing, too exhausted to engage with their children, too worn out to maintain any interests outside the mill. The human cost extended beyond the workplace. Marriages suffered when husbands were never home, always exhausted, always irritable from lack of sleep. Children grew up with fathers who were strangers, present only as sleeping forms in the corner of the room. Communities developed around shift schedules, with families learning to live in the gaps between work and sleep. And they died, in staggering numbers. Fatal accidents in the steel mills accounted for 20% of all male deaths in Pittsburgh during the 1880s. Think about that number. 1 in 5 men who died in the city died in the mills. Newspaper casualty lists from the era read, according to one contemporary writer, like reports from a small Civil War battle. 25,000 Americans were dying on the job every year by 1900, and the steel industry was among the deadliest. When a furnace exploded, when a crane cable snapped, when a man slipped into a channel of molten metal, there was no workers' compensation, no life insurance, no pension for the widow. The family of a dead steelworker received nothing from the company. They were simply replaced. There were always more men waiting at the gates, immigrants from Eastern Europe desperate for any work at all. Carnegie himself rarely visited the mills. He spent much of his time in Scotland at his castle, writing essays about the responsibilities of wealth and the dignity of labor. His managers handled the unpleasant realities of production. Chief among them was a man named Henry Clay Frick. Frick was everything Carnegie was not. Where Carnegie cultivated a public image as a friend of the working man, Frick made no such pretense. He was, by all accounts, a man without sentiment. His job was to maximize profits, and he did it with remarkable efficiency. It was Frick who would oversee the most notorious event in Carnegie Steel's history, an event that would define labor relations in America for a generation. July 1892, the Homestead Steel Works, a few miles from Pittsburgh along the Monongahela River, one of the largest and most modern steel mills in the world. The workers at Homestead were represented by the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers, one of the most powerful unions in America. They had won significant concessions in an 1889 strike. Their contract was due to expire on July 1, 1892. Carnegie, conveniently, was in Scotland. He left Frick with explicit instructions: break the union. Frick began by proposing wage cuts. When the union refused to accept them, he locked the workers out. He surrounded the mill with a 12-foot fence topped with barbed wire. Workers called it Fort Frick. He hired 300 guards from the Pinkerton Detective Agency, the private security firm that had become notorious for its role in breaking strikes. On the morning of July the 6th, the Pinkertons arrived on barges towed up the Monongahela River. Word of their approach spread through Homestead like wildfire. By the time the barges reached the mill, 10,000 workers and their families had gathered on the riverbank. What happened next would become known as the Battle of Homestead. The Pinkertons tried to come ashore. The workers refused to let them land. Someone fired a shot. Within minutes, a full-scale battle was underway. The workers had armed themselves with whatever they could find, including an old cannon. The Pinkertons had Winchester repeating rifles. The scene on the riverbank that morning was something out of a war zone. The barges had steel plates bolted to their sides, but the workers' fire was relentless. Bullets punched through the wooden decks. A few of the workers found a small brass cannon, a relic of some long-forgotten celebration, and wheeled it down to the water's edge. They loaded it with scrap metal and fired into the barges at point-blank range. The Pinkertons, many of them recent recruits who had been told they would face no real resistance, were terrified. They had expected to intimidate unarmed workers, not face a battle-hardened army. Many had never fired a weapon in anger. Now they were pinned down, unable to advance or retreat, as bullets and makeshift projectiles rained down on them. The workers' families watched from the hillside above. Women who had packed their husbands' lunches that morning now watched them fight for their lives. Children who had come to see the commotion found themselves witnesses to slaughter. The screams of the wounded could be heard above the gunfire. Some workers tried more desperate measures. They soaked barrels with oil and rolled them down to the river's edge, hoping to set the barges on fire. They poured oil onto the water itself and tried to ignite it. Neither tactic succeeded, but they showed the depth of the workers' determination. They would burn the Pinkertons alive before they would let them take the mill. The fighting lasted 14 hours. When it was over, at least 10 people were dead, 7 workers and 3 Pinkertons, with dozens more wounded. The Pinkertons surrendered and were marched through town, beaten and pelted with debris by the crowd. The surrender was a remarkable moment. 300 armed men, professional strikebreakers employed by one of the most feared private security forces in America, gave up their weapons to a mob of steelworkers. They raised white flags and begged to be allowed off the barges. When they finally came ashore, they were forced to run a gauntlet through the crowd. Men, women, and children beat them with fists and clubs and whatever else was at hand. By the time the Pinkertons reached the town's roller rink where they were to be held, they were bloody and broken. Hugh O'Donnell, one of the strike leaders, tried to maintain order. He knew that killing the Pinkertons would turn public opinion against the workers. He pleaded with the crowd to let the prisoners pass unharmed. His efforts were only partially successful. But the workers' victory was short-lived. The governor of Pennsylvania sent in 8,000 National Guard troops. Martial law was declared. Strikebreakers were brought in to reopen the mill. The union leaders were arrested and charged with murder, treason, and conspiracy. By November, the strike was over. The workers went back to their jobs, at lower wages, with longer hours, and without union representation. The Amalgamated Association was broken. It would take more than 40 years before steelworkers would successfully organize again. Carnegie, from his castle in Scotland, expressed public regret while privately approving everything Frick had done. The two men would later have a bitter falling out, but by then the damage was done. The message to American workers was clear. The companies would use any means necessary to prevent unionization, and the government would help them do it. This was the company, with this history, that J.P. Morgan bought in 1901. John Pierpont Morgan was, by the turn of the century, the most powerful banker in America, perhaps in the world. He had reorganized railroads, rescued the federal government from financial crisis, and built an empire of interlocking investments that touched nearly every major industry. Morgan believed in order. He hated competition. The chaos of the free market offended his sensibilities. His solution was consolidation. Bring competing companies together under single management, eliminate duplication, stabilize prices, ensure predictable profits. Steel was the perfect opportunity. The industry was fragmented, chaotic, riven by price wars. Carnegie's dominance was threatening to his rivals, but also unstable. If Carnegie decided to expand into finished products, he could crush every other steel company in America. The catalyst was a dinner party. In December 1900, at a gathering of industrialists in New York, Charles Schwab, the president of Carnegie Steel, gave a speech. He painted a vision of a unified steel industry, controlled by a single company, achieving economies of scale impossible for any individual firm. He spoke of efficiency, stability, prosperity. Morgan was listening. By the end of the evening, he had decided to act. The negotiations that followed would become legendary in American business history. Morgan was not a man who haggled. He decided what he wanted, determined what it was worth, and made his offer. If the seller accepted, the deal was done. If not, Morgan moved on. With Carnegie, the process was almost absurdly simple. Morgan dispatched his partner, Robert Bacon, to arrange a meeting. Carnegie, ever the negotiator, refused to come to Morgan's office. If Morgan wanted to buy his company, Morgan could come to him. They met at Carnegie's mansion on West 51st Street in Manhattan. The conversation lasted exactly 15 minutes. Morgan asked if the price mentioned at the Schwab dinner was final. Carnegie confirmed it was. Morgan extended his hand. The deal was done. $480 million, the largest business transaction in history up to that point. Agreed to in a quarter of an hour, without lawyers, without accountants, without due diligence of any kind. Two of the most powerful men in America, settling the fate of an empire with a handshake. When Carnegie later reflected on the meeting, he regretted not asking for more. Morgan, for his part, told Carnegie that he was congratulated for being the richest man in the world. It was probably not true, but it was close enough. The actual formation of U.S. Steel took longer. Morgan's lieutenants spent weeks negotiating the acquisition of the other companies that would be folded into the new corporation. Federal Steel, National Steel, American Steel and Wire, American Tin Plate, American Sheet Steel, American Steel Hoop, American Bridge, and others. Each company had its own shareholders, its own managers, its own interests to protect. By February 1901, the deals were done. The capitalization was set at $1.4 billion, a number so large that many questioned whether it had any relationship to actual value. The Bureau of Corporations would later estimate that the real assets underlying USA Steel were worth perhaps $700 million. The rest was water, financial engineering designed to generate profits for the investment bankers who assembled the deal. Morgan and his partners earned an estimated $62 million in fees for their work, a staggering sum representing roughly 4% of the total capitalization for a few months of negotiation. The negotiations were swift and secret. Morgan met with Carnegie once for 15 minutes to confirm the price. Carnegie wrote his number on a slip of paper, $480 million. Morgan agreed without hesitation. He later told Carnegie it was the biggest deal he had ever made. On February 25, 1901, the United States Steel Corporation was formally incorporated in New Jersey. The capitalization was $1.4 billion. The company controlled about two-thirds of America's steel production, along with vast holdings in iron ore, coal, railroads, and shipping. The newspapers called it the billion-dollar trust. Some celebrated it as the pinnacle of American enterprise. Others warned of a dangerous concentration of power. One contemporary observer noted that the managers of the new corporation faced a delicate task, shaping values to break the force of popular antagonism while earning adequate returns for investors. The antagonism was real. This was the era of the muckrakers, of progressive reform, of growing public suspicion toward the great trusts. Standard Oil was under attack. The Northern Securities Company would soon be broken up. Many expected U.S. Steel to face the same fate. But the corporation had something the other trusts lacked: a public relations strategy. Its first chairman was not a banker or an industrialist, but a lawyer named Elbert H. Gary. Judge Gary, as he was known, understood something that Carnegie and Frick never had. In the new century, public opinion mattered. The corporation needed to be seen not as a rapacious monopoly, but as a responsible steward of an essential industry. Gary cultivated journalists, invited them to his office, spoke to them candidly about the corporation's affairs. He instituted what became known as the Gary Dinners, regular meetings with competitors to stabilize prices without formal agreements that might violate antitrust laws. He spoke the language of cooperation, of industry self-regulation, of enlightened capitalism. It was a masterful performance, and it worked, at least in the courts. In 1911, the federal government finally moved against U.S. Steel, filing an antitrust suit seeking to break up the company. The case dragged on for nearly a decade, and in 1920, the Supreme Court ruled in the corporation's favor. The reasoning was remarkable. The court acknowledged that U.S. Steel had been formed with monopolistic intent. It acknowledged that the Gary Dinners had involved price fixing, but it held that the company had not actually achieved a monopoly, that its competitors remained viable, and that mere size was not in itself illegal. The corporation had survived. It emerged from the progressive era battered but intact. Its market share had declined from two-thirds to about half, but it remained the dominant force in American steel. It would remain so for another half-century. But survival came at a price, and the people who paid that price, as always, were the workers. The conditions that had killed and maimed workers in Carnegie's mills persisted into the 20th century. The 12-hour day continued. The 7-day week continued. The dangerous machinery, the extreme heat, the toxic fumes, all continued. And the corporation, despite Judge Gary's talk of enlightened management, resisted every effort to change them. Consider what the 12-hour day actually meant. A man working the day shift started at 6 in the morning and worked until 6 at night. Then, every 2 weeks, when the shifts rotated, he would work a double shift 24 hours straight to make the transition. One steelworker described his life in testimony before Congress. "You don't know what it is to get up at 4:30 in the morning and work till 6:30 in the night, 12 months in the year. You don't know what it is to go home and not want to do anything but go to bed and get up and go back to work." Another worker put it more simply. "This way, one doesn't want to live long. What is the use of living since one doesn't enjoy life?" The workers had tried to change these conditions in 1892 at Homestead. They had been crushed. They would try again in 1919 in what became known as the Great Steel Strike. The result would be much the same. The strike began on September 22, 1919. More than 300,000 workers walked off their jobs, from Pittsburgh to Chicago to Birmingham. They demanded an 8-hour day, an end to the 7-day week, the right to organize, and a living wage. It was, in many ways, a remarkable moment. Workers who spoke a dozen different languages, who came from countries that had been at war with each other just months before, united in common cause. Polish and Slovak, Hungarian and Croatian, Italian and Greek, black and white, they stood together on the picket lines, demanding their share of the prosperity they had helped create. The organization effort had begun during the war, when labor shortages had given workers unusual bargaining power. William Z. Foster, a former Industrial Workers of the World organizer, who would later become a leader of the American Communist Party, led the drive. John Fitzpatrick, president of the Chicago Federation of Labor, provided crucial support. Together, they had signed up more than 100,000 workers in the months leading up to the strike. The workers' grievances were real and urgent. Despite record profits during the war years, wages had barely kept pace with inflation. The cost of living had nearly doubled, but pay increases had been grudging and inadequate. Workers who had sacrificed during the war, accepting long hours and dangerous conditions as their patriotic duty, now expected some reward for their efforts. Judge Gary, still running U.S. Steel, refused even to meet with the union representatives. His public position was that the corporation had no dispute with its employees, only with outside agitators, many of them, he implied, foreign radicals with un-American ideas. Gary's position was not merely obstinate, it was strategic. He understood that the success of the strike depended on public sympathy. If he could convince Americans that the strikers were dangerous radicals, threats to the American way of life, he could isolate them politically and break their movement. The timing helped his cause. This was the year of the Red Scare, when Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer was conducting raids against suspected radicals across the country. Bombs had exploded outside Palmer's house and on Wall Street. The fear of Bolshevism was at its height. The accusation stuck. This was 1919, the year of the Red Scare, when Americans were gripped by fear of Bolshevism in the wake of the Russian Revolution. The steel companies skillfully exploited these fears, painting the strikers as dangerous revolutionaries, threatening the American way of life. The reality was very different. Most of the strikers were not radicals of any kind. They were family men who wanted to spend time with their children. They were churchgoers who believed in the American dream. They were workers who had given years of their lives to the mills and wanted nothing more than a fair day's pay for a fair day's work. But the newspapers did not tell their story. With few exceptions, the press aligned itself with the companies. Strikers were portrayed as foreign agitators, their demands as un-American, their methods as violent and threatening. The New York Times, the Chicago Tribune, and papers across the country repeated the company's talking points as though they were established facts. Newspapers, with few exceptions, supported the companies. Public opinion, initially sympathetic to the workers, turned against them. Local officials banned union meetings, arrested organizers, and allowed company police to break up picket lines with impunity. In one Pennsylvania town, the mayor declared that not even Jesus Christ could hold a meeting in support of the strikers. Union organizers who tried anyway were jailed and fined. By early 1920, the strike had collapsed. The workers returned to their jobs without winning any of their demands. The 12-hour day continued. The 7-day week continued. The right to organize remained unrecognized. It would take 4 more years and pressure from the federal government itself before U.S. Steel finally agreed to eliminate the 12-hour day. In 1923, President Warren Harding personally wrote to Judge Gary, warning that legislation would follow if the industry did not act. Only then did the corporation yield, nearly 30 years after workers had first demanded the change. By then, tens of thousands had given their health, their youth, their lives to the furnaces. They had built the steel that built America, and they had been compensated with poverty wages, broken bodies, and early graves. But the struggle was not over. In the 1930s, a new generation of workers would rise to challenge the steel companies, and they would face violence that shocked even a nation grown accustomed to labor conflict. The Great Depression had devastated the steel industry. Mills that had run continuously for decades fell silent. Workers who had known nothing but steady employment found themselves on breadlines, competing for charity handouts with men who had once been their neighbors. The proud middle class of the mill towns was reduced to poverty. But the Depression also created opportunity. The election of Franklin Roosevelt in 1932 brought new hope to labor. The National Industrial Recovery Act, passed in 1933, guaranteed workers the right to organize and bargain collectively. The Wagner Act of 1935 strengthened these protections and created the National Labor Relations Board to enforce them. The Congress of Industrial Organizations, led by the fiery John L. Lewis of the United Mine Workers, saw its chance. In 1936, Lewis launched the Steel Workers Organizing Committee, a massive campaign to unionize the entire steel industry. Organizers fanned out across the mill towns, signing up workers by the thousands. By early 1937, they were ready to act. The first target was U.S. Steel itself, the heart of the industry. Many expected a brutal fight. Instead, the company capitulated with barely a struggle. In March 1937, Chairman Myron Taylor met secretly with Lewis and agreed to recognize the union, accept the 8-hour day and 40-hour week, and grant a 10% wage increase. The agreement stunned the industry. The mighty corporation, which had crushed the Homestead strike and broken the 1919 walkout, had surrendered without a battle. Many speculated that Taylor feared a costly strike during an economic recovery, or that he saw unionization as inevitable and wanted to make the best deal possible. Whatever the reason, U.S. Steel's capitulation isolated the remaining holdouts. A group of smaller companies, known as Little Steel, refused to follow the corporation's lead. Republic Steel, Bethlehem Steel, Youngstown Sheet and Tube, and others vowed to resist unionization at all costs. The result was one of the bloodiest chapters in American labor history. On Memorial Day, May 30th, 1937, a crowd of strikers and their families gathered at Sam's Place, a tavern near Republic Steel's South Chicago plant. They had been on strike for 4 days. The mood was festive, almost like a holiday. Women had packed picnic lunches. Children ran and played in the warm spring sun. University students and social workers had come to show solidarity. Altogether, perhaps 1,500 people assembled to march to the plant gates. What happened next would become known as the Memorial Day Massacre. About 300 Chicago police officers, many of them armed with clubs and firearms provided by Republic Steel itself, blocked the marchers' path. When the crowd refused to disperse, the police attacked. They fired directly into the crowd. They clubbed men, women, and children without discrimination. They pursued fleeing workers across the open field, shooting them in the back. They beat people who had already fallen, who were trying to surrender, who posed no threat to anyone. When it was over, 10 people lay dead or dying. 30 more had been shot. Nearly 100 others had been clubbed or beaten. A woman who had come to support the strikers had been shot in the leg. An 11-year-old boy had been wounded. A 17-year-old, there simply to see what was happening, would die of his injuries 2 weeks later. The police claimed they had acted in self-defense, that they had been attacked by a violent mob. Newspapers reported this version as fact. The Chicago Tribune published accounts of outside agitators and communist infiltrators leading the assault. But there was evidence that told a different story. A Paramount newsreel crew had filmed the entire incident. When the footage was developed, it showed the marchers advancing peacefully, showed the police opening fire without provocation, showed officers beating people who were already on the ground. Paramount refused to release the film, fearing it would incite riots. Only when a Senate committee subpoenaed the footage did the truth become public. The hearings, led by Senator Robert La Follette, Jr., revealed systematic violence by police and company guards throughout the Little Steel strike. They documented the use of tear gas and firearms against peaceful demonstrators. They exposed the coordination between steel companies and local law enforcement. The committee's conclusion was damning. The strikers had been attacked without justification. The police had used excessive force. The companies had orchestrated a campaign of terror against their own workers. But the damage was done. The Little Steel strike collapsed in the wake of the massacre. Workers, demoralized and frightened, drifted back to their jobs. The SWAC had won the battle for public opinion, but it had lost the war. It would take another 4 years, and the pressure of an impending world war, before Little Steel finally recognized the Union. In 1941, with the government demanding labor peace to support the defense buildup, Republic Steel and the other holdouts signed contracts with the SWAC. The long fight for Union recognition was finally over, but the cost had been staggering. 18 workers died in the Little Steel strike of 1937, most of them in the Memorial Day Massacre. Hundreds more were injured. Thousands were blacklisted from the industry they had spent their lives serving. A sculpture stands today near the site of the massacre, steel tubes representing each of the 10 who died that day. Most people who pass it have no idea what it commemorates. The names of the dead, Sam Popovich and Earl Handley and Kenneth Reed and the others, have faded from public memory. But the lesson remains. The cost of challenging power, of demanding a share of the wealth you help create, can be measured in blood. The cost was immense, and it extended far beyond the individual workers. Entire communities had been shaped for better and for worse by the corporation's decisions. Consider Gary, Indiana, the city that bears Judge Elbert Gary's name. Built from scratch by U.S. Steel starting in 1906, it was designed to be the ultimate company town. The site was chosen for its location on Lake Michigan, midway between the iron ore mines of Minnesota and the coal fields of West Virginia and Pennsylvania. The corporation moved 11 million cubic feet of sand to prepare the ground. It straightened rivers, drained swamps, and created a harbor for ore boats. Before U.S. Steel arrived, the land was little more than sand dunes and swamp. Within 2 years, it was transformed into one of the largest industrial complexes in the world. The speed of construction was breathtaking. Thousands of workers labored around the clock, racing to complete the mill before competitors could react. The first blast furnace was lit in 1908. By the end of that year, Gary Works was producing hundreds of tons of steel daily. Within a decade, it would become the largest steel mill in the world. Gary Works, as the mill was called, became the largest steel mill in the world. It covered more than 1,500 acres along the lakeshore. Its blast furnaces could be seen for miles, their flames lighting the night sky. The scale was almost incomprehensible. The main building stretched for miles along the shore. Railroad tracks crisscrossed the complex, carrying ore cars and steel ingots between the various facilities. Smokestacks rose hundreds of feet into the air, pouring out the fumes that would coat everything for miles around. The heat from the furnaces could be felt from blocks away. At night, the glow from the open hearths turned the sky orange, visible from Chicago 30 miles distant. Workers joked that they never needed streetlights. The mills provided all the illumination anyone could want. Around the mill, a city rose. U.S. Steel laid out the streets, built the houses, installed the sewers and waterworks. It attracted workers from across Europe and the American South, promising good wages and steady employment. The company approached city building with the same efficiency it brought to steelmaking. Streets were laid out in a perfect grid. Houses were constructed according to standardized plans, rows of identical dwellings for the workers, larger homes for foremen and managers, estates for the top executives. Churches, schools, and shops were positioned to serve the needs of the workforce. It was paternalism at its most comprehensive. The company owned the land, built the infrastructure, and controlled the basic services. Workers were dependent on U.S. Steel for everything from their paycheck to their water supply. By 1930, Gary had a population of more than 100,000, representing over 50 different nationalities. It was one of the most diverse places in America. It was also completely dependent on a single employer. The diversity was remarkable. Hungarian and Polish neighborhoods existed alongside communities of Slovaks and Croats. African Americans who had fled the Jim Crow South lived near recent arrivals from Italy and Greece. More than 50 languages were spoken in the schools. The city was a microcosm of industrial America, drawing workers from across the globe to forge the steel that would build the nation. For decades, the arrangement worked. The mills ran continuously, producing steel for automobiles, appliances, skyscrapers, and ships. Workers earned middle-class wages, families bought homes, sent their children to school, built churches and social clubs. Gary's prosperity was real, if precarious. In the good years, the mill workers earned enough to buy modest homes, to take summer vacations at nearby beaches on Lake Michigan, to dream of sending their children to college. The downtown hummed with activity. Department stores and movie theaters lined Broadway. The Gary Hotel, an elegant structure designed by a prominent Chicago architect, served guests from across the region. Then, in the 1970s, the bottom fell out. The causes were complex. Foreign competition, particularly from Japan and Germany, whose steel industries had been rebuilt after World War II with newer, more efficient technology. Changing markets, as automobiles and appliances began using more plastic and aluminum. Rising labor costs, environmental regulations. Corporate decisions to invest in overseas production rather than domestic modernization. The result was devastation. U.S. Steel's Gary Works employed over 30,000 people in 1970. By 1990, that number had fallen to 6,000. Today, it employs around 2,000. Each lost job took with it several more in supporting industries, the suppliers and contractors and small businesses that depended on the workers' wages. The city of Gary followed the mills down. From a peak population of nearly 180,000 in 1960, it has fallen to around 70,000 today. Whole neighborhoods have been abandoned. Thousands of buildings stand empty, slowly collapsing into ruin. The tax base has cratered, leaving the city unable to maintain basic services. Drive through Gary today, and you will see the landscape of deindustrialization, boarded up storefronts on what was once a thriving commercial strip. Schools closed for lack of students, houses reduced to rubble, with grass growing where living rooms used to be. About a third of the city's structures are considered blighted. About a quarter of the population lives in poverty. Crime rates have been among the highest in the nation. Life expectancy is years below the national average. The people who remain speak of abandonment by the company that built their city, by the government that failed to help when the mills closed, by an economy that seemed to have no use for them anymore. This is what happens when a community's fate is tied to a single industry, a single company. When that company thrives, the community thrives. When it declines, the community has no cushion, no alternative, no way to adapt. Gary is not unique. The same story played out across the Rust Belt, from Youngstown to Pittsburgh to Cleveland. Communities that had been built on steel saw their economies collapse in a matter of years. Workers who had expected to spend their entire careers in the mills found themselves suddenly unemployed, their skills obsolete, their futures uncertain. Between 1976 and 1986, nearly 300,000 American steelworkers lost their jobs. Most never found comparable employment. Many never really recovered. The human toll is incalculable. Marriages that ended under the stress of unemployment, children who grew up in poverty, health problems exacerbated by lack of insurance, suicides, overdoses, early deaths from despair. And through it all, the corporation survived. Diminished, restructured, sold and resold, but still in existence, still producing steel, still bearing the name it had carried since 1901. There is another cost that has only recently begun to be fully understood. The environmental cost, the legacy of more than a century of heavy industry, written in poisoned soil and polluted air and contaminated water. Pittsburgh was once known as hell with the lid off. The phrase came from a 19th century writer who saw the city shrouded in perpetual smoke, its skies darkened by the emissions of countless furnaces. James Parton, writing for The Atlantic in 1868, described what he saw from the hills above the city. Pittsburgh is smoke, 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 everywhere smoke. The sky was perpetually gray. Soot coated every surface. Laundry hung outside to dry would be filthy again within hours. Women learned to do their washing on Sundays, when the mills were sometimes quiet, because that was the only day the air was breathable. The smoke came from the coal that powered the mills. Pittsburgh sat atop some of the richest deposits of bituminous coal in the world, a fortunate geological accident that made the region ideal for steel production. But bituminous coal burns dirty, very dirty. The combustion released sulfur dioxide, which combined with moisture in the air to form sulfuric acid. Trees died, metal corroded, stone buildings eroded. People developed respiratory diseases that shortened their lives by years. One contemporary observer described the view from a boat on the Monongahela River. The whole horizon was lit with the glare of furnaces, and the air was heavy with the smell of burning sulfur. Occasionally a gust of wind would clear the smoke momentarily, revealing a hellscape of flame and molten metal. It was as if the earth had opened up and we were looking into the underworld. Contemporary accounts describe conditions that seem almost unimaginable today. At noon, the downtown streets were so dark that streetlights had to be turned on. Ladies' white gloves turned gray within hours. Trees on the hillsides were killed by the acidic fumes, leaving the slopes bare and brown. The pollution was not just ugly, it was deadly. Studies from the early 20th century found that Pittsburgh had some of the highest death rates from respiratory disease in the nation. Tuberculosis, pneumonia, and bronchitis claimed thousands of lives every year. Children were particularly vulnerable. Infant mortality rates in the mill towns exceeded those in many developing countries. Inside the mills, conditions were even worse. Workers breathed in fumes from the furnaces, dust from the ore, particles of metal and slag. There were no masks, no ventilation systems, no protection of any kind. Men developed respiratory diseases that shortened their lives by years, sometimes by decades. The condition became known as siderosis, the accumulation of iron particles in the lungs. It was an occupational disease, as characteristic of steelmaking as black lung was of coal mining. Workers coughed up red-tinged sputum, struggled to catch their breath, watched their health decline year by year. Most did not live to see old age. The rivers fared no better. The mills needed vast quantities of water for cooling and processing. That water, mixed with oils and chemicals and metallic residues, was dumped directly back into the rivers. The Monongahela, the Allegheny, the Ohio, all were effectively industrial sewers, too polluted for fish, too toxic for swimming. Their surfaces sometimes coated with oil that could catch fire. This was accepted as the price of progress. Smoke meant jobs, pollution meant prosperity. To complain was to be ungrateful, to fail to appreciate the wealth that industry brought. It took decades to change this attitude. The Clean Air Act of 1970 and its subsequent amendments forced the mills to reduce their emissions. The Clean Water Act imposed limits on what could be dumped into the rivers. Environmental lawsuits compelled cleanups of the most egregiously polluted sites. Pittsburgh today is a vastly cleaner city than it was 50 years ago. The skies are blue. The rivers support fish and recreation. The hills are green again. But the legacy remains. Recent studies have found toxic metals throughout Pittsburgh's soil, particularly in the eastern half of the city. Arsenic, cadmium, copper, lead, zinc, all the byproducts of more than a century of steel production, deposited by smoke and trapped by the weather inversions that keep pollution close to the ground in the river valleys. These contaminants pose health risks to residents, particularly children. They affect community gardens and urban farms. They complicate development and redevelopment. They will persist for generations, a permanent reminder of the industry's true cost. And the pollution is not entirely historical. U.S. Steel still operates facilities in the Pittsburgh area, including the Clairton Coke Works, the largest coke plant in North America. Coke is the processed coal that fuels the blast furnaces, and making it releases a toxic stew of chemicals into the air. The communities around Clairton are among the most polluted in the United States. Residents suffer elevated rates of asthma and other respiratory diseases. Cancer rates are above average. The air sometimes smells of sulfur, the distinctive odor of hydrogen sulfide, a gas that in high concentrations can cause unconsciousness and death. Walk through Clairton on a bad air day, and you will see what living with industrial pollution means. Children play indoors because their parents fear what the air will do to their lungs. Elderly residents sit on their porches, handkerchiefs held to their faces. The smell is everywhere, acrid and unmistakable, the smell of money being made at someone else's expense. The health department monitors air quality, but the monitors cannot capture what residents experience day after day. The particulate matter that lodges in lungs, the benzene that accumulates in blood, the long-term damage that takes years to manifest but shortens lives all the same. A Clairton resident described life near the plant. Some days you wake up and the air is so bad you can taste it. Your eyes burn, your throat closes up. You keep your kids inside and hope it clears before they have to go to school. And you wonder every day what this is doing to them, what it's doing to all of us. Studies have found that children in Clairton and the surrounding communities have asthma rates far above the national average. Hospital emergency rooms see spikes in respiratory complaints whenever the plant has an emissions event. Doctors have learned to correlate their patient loads with wind direction and weather patterns. Environmental groups have sued U.S. Steel repeatedly over violations at Clairton. In 2018, a fire at the plant damaged pollution control equipment, leading to months of elevated emissions. Residents reported difficulty breathing, acidic smells, a visible haze over their neighborhoods. The fire occurred on Christmas Eve, a cruel irony that was not lost on the community. For weeks afterward, the plant operated without its pollution controls, spewing sulfur dioxide and other pollutants into the air. The Allegheny County Health Department issued warnings for residents to stay indoors, but many could not afford to miss work, could not afford to keep their children home from school. Lawsuits followed. Environmental groups documented hundreds of violations of the plant's air permits. U.S. Steel paid fines, promised improvements, pledged to do better. But the fundamental problems persisted. The coke ovens continued to operate. The emissions continued to rise. The residents continued to suffer. The company has invested in improvements, and it has pledged to do more. But the fundamental problem remains. The coke-making process is inherently dirty, and the communities around the plant bear the burden of that reality. These are communities of color, communities of low income, communities without the political power to demand change. They have suffered the costs of steel production for generations. They continue to suffer them today. The environmental cost, like the human cost, is rarely included in the accounting of industrial success. The balance sheets show profits and losses, production figures and market share. They do not show the children with asthma, the soil that cannot safely grow vegetables, the rivers that took decades to recover. This is the hidden subsidy that industry has always extracted from the communities around it. The right to use the air and water as dumping grounds, to externalize the costs of production onto people who have no choice but to bear them. In the beginning, there was no alternative. no technology to clean the emissions, no awareness of the long-term consequences. But that innocence ended long ago. The choice to continue polluting, even as the science became clear and the technology became available, was just that, a choice, a decision to prioritize profits over health, production over people. The corporation made that choice again and again for more than a century. The communities around its mills have paid the price. By the 1980s, the American steel industry was in crisis. U.S. Steel, once the mightiest industrial corporation in the world, was struggling to survive. The numbers told the story. In 1973, the United States produced 111 million tons of steel. By 1984, production had collapsed to just 70 million tons. Imports had surged from a negligible share to nearly a quarter of the market. Employment in the industry had plummeted from 400,000 to barely 150,000. The causes were debated endlessly. Labor blamed management for failing to invest in modernization. Management blamed labor for demanding wages and benefits that made American steel uncompetitive. Everyone blamed the Japanese, whose rebuilt mills were producing steel of higher quality at lower cost. The truth, as always, was more complicated. American steel companies had grown complacent during decades of dominance. They had continued to invest in open-hearth furnaces and other outdated technology, even as their foreign competitors were building more efficient facilities. They had resisted innovation, fought environmental regulations, and relied on political protection rather than competitive improvement. U.S. Steel was perhaps the worst offender. Its market share had been declining for decades, from 2/3 at its founding to barely 10% by the 1980s. Its mills were old, its technology outdated, its management more focused on financial engineering than operational excellence. In 1982, the company recorded its first loss in decades. In 1983, it closed more than a dozen plants, putting tens of thousands of workers out of their jobs. In 1986, it changed its name to USX Corporation, signaling a shift away from steel toward oil and gas and other diversified businesses. The steel industry's crisis was felt most acutely in the communities that depended on it. Youngstown, Ohio, saw 3 major mills close within months of each other in 1977 and 1978, eliminating nearly 10,000 jobs. The local economy never recovered. Today, Youngstown's population is less than half what it was at its peak, and poverty rates remain among the highest in Ohio. Pittsburgh itself saw 95,000 manufacturing jobs disappear between 1980 and 1983. The city has since reinvented itself as a center of education and healthcare and technology, but the transformation was painful and incomplete. Many who lost their jobs in the mills never found equivalent work. The workers who bore the brunt of the collapse had spent their careers building the company's fortune. They had given their health to the heat and fumes. They had worked the 12-hour days and the 7-day weeks. They had fought for the 8-hour day and been beaten for their trouble. Many of these workers had followed their fathers and grandfathers into the mills. Steelmaking was not just a job, it was an identity, a tradition passed down through generations. Families had albums full of photographs showing 3 or 4 generations of men in work clothes, standing in front of the same furnaces, doing the same work their ancestors had done. When the layoffs came, they destroyed more than jobs. They destroyed families. They destroyed communities. They destroyed a way of life that had endured for a century. The psychological toll was devastating. Men who had defined themselves by their work suddenly had nothing to do. They sat in their living rooms, watching television, drinking beer, trying to make sense of what had happened. Their wives went to work at minimum-wage jobs to keep the family afloat. Their children watched their parents' marriage disintegrate under the strain. Depression rates soared. Domestic violence increased. Substance abuse became epidemic. Suicide rates in the former mill towns climbed to levels far above the national average. One Youngstown steelworker, interviewed years later, described returning home after being laid off. "I walked in the door and my wife looked at me. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. We both knew. 23 years I'd given that company, and they threw me away like a piece of scrap." Now they were being told they were redundant, that the skills they had spent decades acquiring were worthless, that the communities they had built were obstacles to progress. The rage was understandable. Workers protested, lobbied, pleaded for help. They sent busloads to Washington with petitions signed by 100,000 people. They held rallies. They made their case in every forum they could find. It made no difference. The mills closed anyway. This is the great betrayal at the heart of the American industrial story. The promise, explicit or implied, was that hard work and loyalty would be rewarded, that if you gave your life to the company would take care of you. The reality was different. The company would take care of itself. When your labor was profitable, you would be employed. When it was not, you would be discarded. The profits you had helped generate would be distributed to shareholders and executives. The costs of your unemployment, your retraining, your community's collapse would be borne by you and by the taxpayer. Some of those executives did quite well during the crisis. Even as workers were being laid off by the thousands, compensation at the top of the corporate hierarchy continued to rise. Stock buybacks and dividend payments continued, funded in part by the savings from eliminated jobs. This pattern, corporations enriching their shareholders while impoverishing their workers and communities, has become so common as to seem almost inevitable. But it is not inevitable. It is a choice. A choice made by executives and boards of directors, enabled by government policies that prioritize capital over labor, protected by a legal system that treats corporations as entities with rights but limited responsibilities. U.S. Steel survived the crisis of the 1980s, barely. It sold off its non-steel businesses, closed its least productive mills, and invested in new technology. By the 1990s, it had stabilized, though at a fraction of its former size. But the communities it had abandoned did not recover so easily. They are still struggling today, decades later, still dealing with the aftermath of the great deindustrialization. The story should have ended there, perhaps. A once great company reduced to a shadow of its former self. A cautionary tale about the perils of complacency and the ruthlessness of global competition. But history does not end so neatly. In December 2023, Nippon Steel, Japan's largest steelmaker, announced that it would acquire U.S. Steel for nearly $15 billion. The company that had symbolized American industrial might for more than a century would become a subsidiary of a foreign corporation. The announcement triggered an immediate political firestorm. President Biden expressed opposition. President Trump vowed to block the deal if re-elected. The United Steelworkers Union objected. Members of Congress from both parties raised concerns about national security and American jobs. The ironies were thick. Japan, whose steel industry had helped destroy American steelmaking in the 1970s and 1980s, was now offering to rescue one of its last survivors. The corporation that had built the arsenal of democracy, that had supplied the steel for the ships and tanks that won World War II, would be owned by a company from the nation those ships and tanks had defeated. For 18 months, the deal was caught in political limbo. Biden blocked it in his final days in office. Trump, despite his earlier opposition, eventually allowed it to proceed, under conditions that gave the federal government unprecedented oversight of a private company. On June 18, 2025, the acquisition was finalized. U.S. Steel became a wholly owned subsidiary of Nippon Steel Corporation. The company name would be preserved. The headquarters would remain in Pittsburgh. American workers would keep their jobs, at least for now. But the symbolism was unmistakable. The corporation that had once embodied American industrial supremacy was now controlled by foreign owners. The arc of more than a century had come to its conclusion. Or perhaps not its conclusion, perhaps just another chapter. Steel, after all, is still essential. Buildings still need it. Cars still need it. Ships and bridges and wind turbines still need it. The world produces nearly 2 billion tons of steel every year, more than ever before in history. The question is not whether steel will continue to be made, but by whom and under what conditions and at what cost. Nippon Steel has promised to invest billions in U.S. Steel's American facilities. It has committed to modernizing plants, adopting new technologies, reducing emissions. It has pledged to protect jobs and honor union contracts. Whether these promises will be kept remains to be seen. Corporate promises have been broken before. The workers of Homestead were promised a voice in their workplace. The residents of Gary were promised a prosperous future. Both were betrayed. But there are reasons for cautious optimism. Nippon Steel is known for its advanced technology and efficient operations. It has expressed genuine interest in American manufacturing. The national security provisions in the acquisition give the government leverage it has never had before over the company's decisions. Perhaps this time will be different. Perhaps the new owners will prove to be better stewards than the old. Perhaps the communities that have suffered for so long will finally see investment and renewal. Or perhaps history will repeat itself once more. Perhaps the promises will prove empty, the investments illusory, the jobs temporary. Perhaps the workers of Gary and Pittsburgh and Birmingham will find themselves abandoned again, discarded as soon as their labor ceases to be profitable. We will not know for years, perhaps decades. What we do know is this: the cost has already been paid. The workers who died in the mills cannot be brought back. The communities that were destroyed cannot be easily rebuilt. The rivers that were poisoned, the soil that was contaminated, the air that was fouled, these will take generations to fully heal. The profits have been distributed. The executives have collected their bonuses. The shareholders have received their dividends. The cost has been externalized, spread across workers and communities and future generations who had no say in the decisions that shaped their lives. This is the dark empire that built the world's largest steel company. Not just the smokestacks and furnaces, not just the bridges and skyscrapers, but the broken bodies and devastated towns and poisoned landscapes. The steel they made is everywhere. The Chrysler Building and the Brooklyn Bridge, the Panama Canal and the USS Missouri, the cars we drive and the buildings where we work, and the infrastructure that holds our civilization together. But the cost is everywhere too. In the empty storefronts of Gary and the brownfields of Pittsburgh, in the lungs of workers who breathe the fumes, and the children who play in contaminated soil, in the communities that rose and fell with the corporations' fortunes, that gave everything and received nothing in return. There is a memorial in Homestead, Pennsylvania, to the workers who died in the 1892 strike. It is a simple monument, easily overlooked, on the site where blood was spilled for the right to organize. Most people who pass by do not notice it. Most have never heard of the Homestead strike. The history has faded, replaced by the gleaming new developments that have risen on the old mill sites. But the lesson remains. The cost of progress is always paid by someone. The question is who pays and how much, and whether they have any choice in the matter. For more than a century, the workers of the steel industry paid that cost. They gave their labor and their health, and often their lives. They built the infrastructure of modern America, and when they were no longer needed, they were discarded. Their story is not a tragedy in the classical sense. There is no catharsis, no redemption, no moment when the suffering is revealed to have had meaning. There is only the accumulation of loss, generation after generation, community after community, worker after worker. But their story is important because it tells us something essential about how our economy works, about who benefits and who pays, about the gap between the promises we make and the reality we create. The corporation promised prosperity. It delivered it to some for a time, but the prosperity was always precarious, always dependent on decisions made in distant boardrooms by people who would never set foot in the mills. When the decisions changed, the prosperity vanished. What remains is the memory of what was built and what was lost. The memory of the workers who rose before dawn and came home after dark, who gave their bodies to the furnaces and received nothing in return. The memory of the communities that trusted a corporation with their fate and were abandoned when they were no longer useful. And the question that has haunted the American working class for more than a century, the question that remains unanswered, perhaps unanswerable. What does it cost to build an empire? The answer we know now is everything. The steel mills along the Monongahela still stand, some of them. You can see them from the hills above Pittsburgh, rust red against the green of the recovered forests. They are smaller now, quieter, employing a fraction of the workers they once did. The furnaces still glow at night, orange light reflecting off the river. The barges still carry ore upstream and steel downstream. The work goes on, as it has for more than a century, producing the metal that builds our world. But something has changed. The certainty is gone. The promise that the mills would always be here, that the jobs would always be available, that the community would always have a place in the economy, that promise has been broken too many times to be believed again. The workers who remain know this. They work hard, they take pride in their craft, but they do not expect the company to take care of them. They have seen too many layoffs, too many closures, too many promises broken. The communities around the mills know it too. They have diversified their economies as best they can, attracting hospitals and universities and technology companies. They no longer depend on steel for their survival. They cannot afford to. This is perhaps the final lesson of the U.S. steel story. That dependency is dangerous. That trust must be earned and can be lost. That the interests of a corporation and the interests of a community are not the same, no matter what the promotional materials say. The corporation still exists. It will continue to exist under new ownership for the foreseeable future. It will produce steel and employ workers and generate profits for its shareholders. But the empire is gone. The dominance, the power, the assumption that what was good for U.S. Steel was good for America, all of that has passed into history. What remains is the work. The actual work of making steel, which is dangerous and demanding and requires skill and dedication. The workers who do this work deserve respect and fair compensation and a voice in the decisions that affect their lives. Whether they will receive these things is uncertain. It has always been uncertain. The history of labor in America is a history of struggle, of gains won and lost and won again, of promises made and broken and occasionally kept. The steel workers of the 21st century face the same fundamental challenge their predecessors faced a century ago: how to secure their interests in a system that does not automatically protect them, how to ensure that the wealth they create is shared fairly, how to build communities that can survive the inevitable changes in the economy. These are not questions with easy answers, but they are the right questions to ask. The story of U.S. Steel is, in the end, a story about power: who has it, who doesn't, and what happens when the gap between them becomes too wide. The corporation had power. The workers, for most of their history, did not. The results were predictable. But power is not static. It can shift. It has shifted before. The workers who were crushed at Homestead in 1892 had successors who organized the steel industry in the 1930s. The communities that were abandoned in the 1980s have begun, slowly, painfully, to rebuild. The future is not written. It will be shaped by the choices we make, the values we hold, the battles we choose to fight. The history of U.S. Steel reminds us what is at stake. It shows us the cost of complacency, the price of powerlessness, the consequences of trusting those who do not deserve our trust. But it also shows us something else: that ordinary people working together can change the course of history, that the powerful are not invincible, that the future belongs to those who fight for it. This is the legacy of the steelworkers, not just the bridges and buildings they constructed, but the example they set, the willingness to stand up for themselves even when the odds seemed hopeless, the insistence that their labor had value, that their lives had meaning, that they deserved a share of the wealth they created. That insistence remains relevant today. In steel mills and warehouses, in offices and hospitals, in every workplace where the balance of power favors the employer over the employee. The struggle continues, in different forms, under different circumstances, but with the same fundamental stakes. The dark empire behind U.S. Steel was built on exploitation and maintained by force. It created enormous wealth for the few at enormous cost to the many. Its history is a warning about what happens when economic power is allowed to concentrate without check. But it is also, in its way, a story of hope, because the empire did not last forever, because the workers eventually organized, because the communities are still there, still fighting, still refusing to give up. The mills may close, the company may change hands, the industry may transform beyond recognition, but the people remain, their stories remain, their example remains. And as long as that is true, the future is not determined. It is contested. It is up for grabs. It belongs to whoever has the courage to fight for it. The sun sets over the Monongahela. The furnaces glow against the darkening sky. Somewhere in Pittsburgh, in Gary, in all the mill towns of America, workers are heading home from their shifts. They are tired, as workers have always been tired, but they are not defeated. They carry with them the accumulated experience of generations, the memory of what was won and what was lost, the knowledge of what the company is capable of and what they themselves are capable of. They know the score, they know the history, and they know that history is not over. It never is. The question now, as it has always been, is who will write the next chapter? The corporations, with their vast resources and political connections, or the workers, with their numbers and their solidarity and their refusal to accept that this is the best we can do? The answer is not predetermined. It will be determined by what we do, by what we demand, by what we are willing to sacrifice to build a better world. The steel workers of the past gave everything they had. The steel workers of the present continue the struggle. The steel workers of the future will inherit whatever we leave them. What will that inheritance be? A world of continued exploitation, where the profits flow to the few and the costs are borne by the many, or something better, something more just, something more worthy of the sacrifices that have already been made. The choice is ours. The time is now. The history of U.S. Steel shows us what happens when we fail to make that choice. It is up to us to ensure that the next century is different. The Dark Empire was real, its costs were real, its victims were real. But so is the possibility of change. So is the power of collective action. So is the stubborn human refusal to accept injustice as inevitable. The story continues. The struggle continues. The future, as always, remains to be written. And somewhere, in the orange glow of the furnaces, in the roar of the mills, in the faces of the workers heading home to their families, there is still hope. There is always hope, even in the shadow of the Dark Empire, even now.